Hi, I'm Ryan Leach with Master the Score, and this is a lesson from my new course with Gavin Leeper, The Legend of Otoe, Composing Music for Anime and JRPGs, Levels 2 and 3. If you want more content on getting better at making music, make sure you like the video and subscribe to Master the Score. Enjoy. In this lesson, we're going to talk about diminished chords and augmented chords, and I'll explain why we group them together in the same lecture. As you know by now, a major triad is built by starting at the root, adding the tones a major third up, and then a minor third up. And minor chords are the opposite. We start at the root and add a tone a minor third up, and then a major third up. Both major and minor chords are built with a pair of opposite thirds. Diminished chords, however, are built by starting at the root, going up a minor third, and then going up a minor third again. And augmented chords start at the root, go up a major third, and go up a major third again. So even though diminished chords and augmented chords have different sounds and they function in different ways, we can see that what they have in common is that their core structure is built by a matching set of thirds. They are both symmetrical in their structure. Something else they share in common is that they are both fairly basic chord types. We just saw they can be built simply from thirds, but they are drastically less common than major and minor chords. Let's get into detail on both, starting with diminished triads. In a major key, the seventh diatonic chord is 7 diminished. In C major, we spell it B, D, F. Seven diminished has a dominant function, which means in chord progressions, it has the same job as 5, which is to lead us back home to 1. The two main differences between 7 diminished and 5 are that 7 diminished is less stable sounding, and it's missing the 5th scale degree, which melodically has a very strong pull back to 1. So here we have a G major chord. Notice how the B pulls us home to C, and the G also has a strong gravity to C. Compare that to 7 diminished to 1. The B still pulls into C, but we don't get that strong G to C sound. Because a diminished triad is so unstable sounding, in traditional harmony the 7 diminished is used in first inversion, meaning the third will be in the bass. So rather than B, D, F, we would spell the chord from the bass up D, F, B. The order of the upper voices doesn't matter as long as we have that D in the bass. And also, to stick with traditional harmony, that B, the leading tone, must always resolve to the tonic, or in other words, up to C. You can also use a diminished chord the same way you'd use a secondary dominant. Instead of the 5 of something, it becomes the 7 diminished of something. For example, in C major, we could have a 7 diminished of 2, a C sharp diminished triad resolving to D minor. Just remember to put it in first inversion. That's the basic traditional use of the 7 diminished triad. But of course, that's not the only way we can use diminished triads. They have a dark and mysterious sound, and it's perfectly acceptable to lean into that directly. For example, we could create a vamp where we slowly arpeggiate a D diminished triad, rocking back and forth. It feels ominous and mysterious, easily sets the stage for some sort of dark curse or evil character. Now let's add a 7th to the chord. There are actually two ways we can add a seventh to a diminished triad. The first way is to continue our pattern of stacking minor thirds. For example, if we take E, G, B flat and stack another minor third on top, we get D flat. E, G, B flat, D flat is called an E fully diminished seventh chord, and we write it as E with a little circle and then 7. It's fully diminished because against the root we have the diminished fifth. We also have a diminished seventh. Remember, major seventh would be D sharp, minor seventh is a step lower, D natural, diminished seventh is a step lower than that, D flat. Like this diminished triad, the diminished seventh chord usually functions like a 5 chord. It has a dominant function. One way to think of it is as a dominant 7 flat 9 chord without the root. E diminished 7 comes from the key of F minor, and the 5-7 flat 9 chord in F minor is C7 flat 9. C7 flat 9 is C, E, G, B flat, D flat, or in other words, scale degree 5 plus that 7 diminished 7 on top. Here's the crazy thing about diminished seventh chords though. Because they are perfectly symmetrical, meaning that we could rotate the 4 tones around in any order and still have a stack of minor thirds, you can actually think of a diminished seventh chord as belonging to 8 different keys. Any tone of the chord can be considered the leading tone of a major or minor key. So using our E diminished 7 as an example, E, G, B flat, D flat, the E resolves up to F or F minor. The G resolves up to A flat or A flat minor. The B flat can be respelled as A sharp and resolve up to B or B minor. And the D flat, respelled as C sharp, can resolve up to D or D minor. So this one chord has incredible flexibility. It can be a very convenient pivot if you want to launch off into some new key. There's a quote from Igor Stravinsky where he says, "When I am at a loss for how to proceed, I take a chord, often a diminished seventh, and vary it in every possible way until it yields the solution." The other way to add a seventh to the diminished triad is to add a minor seventh. So our E diminished would be E, G, B flat, and then we add D. This is called a half diminished seventh. Half diminished because only the fifth is diminished and not the whole chord. It can also be called a minor 7 flat 5 because you'll notice it looks just like E minor 7 but with a flat 5. I prefer the name minor 7 flat 5 because I think most of the time you'll find this chord being used as a 2 chord in minor. Either just the regular 2 in a minor key or the 2 minor 7 flat 5 being paired with a 5-7 in a minor 2-5-1 progression. Let's go back to treating it as a half diminished seventh chord. We notate it by putting the little circle and 7, just like the fully diminished seventh, but this time we draw a little line through the circle. Both the half and fully diminished seventh chords can be used with a dominant function. And because of the fuller sound of the chord, you don't actually have to put them in first inversion like you did with the triad. And of course, diminished seventh chords are great for non-functional purposes as well. Here we could create a cool, mysterious pulsing figure by going back and forth between the half and fully diminished version of the same chord. It can also be an interesting tool for voice leading into a major seventh chord. For example, to get from F sharp minor 7 flat 5 to F major 7, just move the bass note down by a half step and keep the rest of the voices in the same place. Next up is the augmented triad, which in some ways is the opposite to a diminished triad. While the diminished triad is built from minor thirds and very tight and restricted feeling, The augmented triad is built from major thirds and is more expansive. We notate an augmented triad with a plus sign, so C augmented is C+. The vast majority of the time, you'll find augmented triads used in one of two ways: as an alternate 5 chord or as a passing chord. For passing between two harmonies, augmented chords allow us to have smooth chromatic lines in our voicings. For example, we could go C, C augmented, A minor over C, C7. Or we could go the other way: C, B augmented, G minor over B flat. In both examples, we passed between different harmonies, but kept a common tone constant the entire time. The other use of augmented chords I mentioned is that it's a substitute for 5, or an altered 5. Just like 5, it has a dominant function and wants to resolve home to 1. The main difference is in the sound and color, with the augmented chord being much crunchier and more dissonant sounding. Similar to the fully diminished 7th chord, the augmented triad is perfectly symmetrical, no matter which way you order the tones. That means that you could interpret any pitch as the root, 3rd, and augmented 5th. Or in other words, any augmented triad can resolve to 6 different keys. And finally, let's add a 7th to the augmented triad. We could add a major 7th, so for G augmented major 7, that would be G, B, D sharp, F sharp. What's interesting about this chord is that despite the raised 5th, overall to my ear the chord has a pretty stable sound. Don't get me wrong, I still think it's very dark and mysterious, perfect for a spy anime or something. But what I mean is that I don't feel any pull or urge to resolve to some other chord. We can also add a minor 7th, with G augmented 7 being G, B, D sharp, F. And in this case, we do get a sense of restlessness and urge to resolve elsewhere. That's because the F creates a tritone interval with the B, and now our ear is itching for that tritone to resolve. When people say augmented 7th chord, they are probably referring to the dominant version, G, B, D sharp, F, not the major 7 version. If you want the major 7 version, you need to be explicit and say augmented major 7th. Unlike the augmented triad, which is perfectly symmetrical, the augmented 7th chord is no longer symmetrical, which means that it loses that flexibility and will function pretty much the same way you would use any other dominant chord. Also, pay attention to the difference between 5 augmented 7 and 5 flat 13. In the case of flat 13, we have both the regular 5 and the flat 13. But in the augmented 7, we only have that augmented 5th. So far, we've covered chordal and quintal voicings, diminished and augmented chords, and the concept of non-functional harmony. Next up, you'll have your first homework assignment of this level, where we'll task you with putting these concepts to work. We'll see you there.